Hello everyone, my name is Tyler Yater, and today I will be speaking to you about the Russian Empire under the reign of Tsar Nicholas I. And the question I'll be asking is, why did Russia fail to modernize and industrialize when the rest of Europe was doing this at the time? A little bit of background about Russia at the time. It was an absolute monarchy under the rule of the Tsars. They had total power over its people, and they were considered divinely appointed by God. So that means they felt that they were accountable to only God himself and no one else. They were also ruled by the Romanov family. The Romanov family constituted all the czars at this time, and it was passed down from father to son. It should also be noted that most of the Russian population were peasants known as serfs who were economically tied to the land, which meant that they weren't slaves. They still had freedoms and rights, albeit very little ones, but they were indebted to the landowners, which meant that they were often forced to work these lands till the day they died. Also, Russia was considered one of the five great powers of Europe, in addition to United Kingdom, France, Austria, and Prussia. Together, they tried to maintain the status quo and order in Europe. A little bit of context about the Western European powers. They were rapidly industrializing and starting to embrace industrialization, particularly France, Britain, and Prussia, which would later become Germany. They were also experimenting with new ways of governments, such as parliamentary government, letting people vote on elected officials, and constitutionalism, writing Bill of Rights for his people, and even giving their people certain rights that couldn't be taken away. Russia, on the other hand, had no such thing. It was still the Tsar and no one else, no parliament, no rights for his people, only the Tsar and his ministers. In general, Western Europe was more free. It should be noted that they were still monarchies and the king still held power, but they were starting to make little by little progress toward liberty and democracy. A little bit of background on Tsar Nicholas himself. He ruled from 1825 to 1855, a 30-year period. He was a very firm believer in the divine right of the monarchy and the Tsar's autocracy. He thought he was the embodiment of Russia, and it was his duty to lead the country himself with no one else's help. He saw himself as the father of the nation. So that means he was very big on tradition, and he was very keen on keeping things the status quo, very suspicious of modernization, education, anything he saw new, and anything he saw as a threat to the Russian people. In the end, he was the only person who could really change the course of Russia and the way it was modernized, because he held absolute power. But he chose not to, and we'll go into why. We talked about why Russia failed to industrialize, and here are some of the reasons. Obviously, Russia was very far behind the other European powers at the time. Part of this was because the economy was very agricultural based with the serfs. There was very little movement of people. The majority of the population was tied to farmland, which meant no one could really work in the cities. There was very little room for social mobility. Another big factor was the lack of education among the serfs. There was no public school system to speak of, and what little schools they had in Russia were usually reserved for the nobility, which meant that the population was very uneducated and a large rate of illiteracy, which means the population was just simply tied to its land, and there was really no way for the people to start modernizing and industrializing on their own. In fact, any industrialization was done by foreign powers such as France, who had to help build the railroads. The Russians themselves did not have the market economics that, say, Britain had. They didn't have the merchants or the corporations necessary to build these. They required on foreign investment because they themselves did not have the infrastructure capable of building things such as railroads and factories. It should be noted that Nicholas did not even believe in railroads because he thought it would disturb the social order. This was a quote by him from the book Grand Strategy of the Russian Empire. You can read that book. It talks about how the Russians planned their economy and their foreign policy, but I chose that quote because it just showed how suspicious Nicholas was of modernization. There were several social issues. Russia was clearly divided into two classes, the landed nobility and the peasants, which was the majority of the population. The land nobility had no reason and no desire to reform, because why should they? They controlled the land, they had all the privileges. There was really no reason to change the status quo from their perspective. The peasants were largely uneducated, and as a result, they had little knowledge of the outside world, or the benefits of education or industrialization could bring to them. They thought that the way things were would always be, and as a result, they were tied to the land, and there was very little movement or desire for change. The only people who desired change were the educated intellectuals who went to Russia's few colleges, and these people were often heavily monitored by the Tsar's agents. In fact, speaking out could get you exiled or killed or arrested. Because of this, the intellectuals were the only people challenging the status quo, but they were often silenced, and they often had to meet in secret because of this. Other problems we talked about before: social mobility. There was no middle class. There was, the middle class that would often develop the merchant class that would often develop economies in the Western Europe was absent from Russia, because it was only rich and poor. There was no middle class necessary for this. The military, despite its victory in the Napoleonic Wars, was becoming increasingly outdated. It looked good in uniform, and that's what the Tsar liked, but its technology and organization it was very apparent that it was becoming outdated, and it would show in the future when they would engage in future wars. Often, government positions were known as a gentleman's social club or a noble gentleman's club, and this meant that the Tsar would appoint his friends, army officers, people he liked, people who weren't necessarily qualified for these jobs, but since they were on the Tsar's good side, they would get these jobs. And that quote comes from an article, "The New and the Old and the Life of Provincial Officialdom during the Modernization of the Russian Empire." It basically talks about how offices in the Russian Empire were gained, and they were often through money, bribery, or just simply knowing someone rather than qualifications, education, and competence. Now, the biggest event of the Tsar's reign was the Crimean War, and this war is important because not only does it show how Russia was incompetent militarily, but it also shows how it failed to match the Western powers in terms of modernization and industrialization. The war was fought between Russia and France, the United Kingdom, over the declining Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been in declining power at that point for almost 100 years, and Russia was keen to take advantage of this decline. However, the Western powers were not going to let Russia do this in interest of keeping the balance of power. So when they went to war, the Western powers were able to invade Crimea and force the Russians into a treaty, which means Russia did not gain anything. The important thing to note from this war is that the Russians had superior numbers, but their outdated organization and their inability to bring troops to the front via railroad and supply them, because they did not have the industrial might to do this, showed how backwards Russia really was. And this war really shows, more than anything, it was like a culminating event in how far back Russia had gone. Consequences of the war, like I have talked about, devastating. Russia lost 500,000 men. More importantly, at least to the Tsar, was the image of the Russian Empire was tarnished. It was seen as a paper tiger, not nearly as strong as people thought it was. It was considered very weak from this point. It would have to rebuild its reputation, and it became very apparent that Russia needed to change things if it was going to keep pace and modernize in the 19th century. It was increasingly apparent that it was a backward nation, and if it didn't change, something bad was going to happen to the Russian monarchy and the empire itself. Closing thoughts was that under Nicholas, while the monarchy was very strong, the traditions were very strong, it was becoming increasingly apparent that this could not last forever. Russia would have to modernize one way or another. It would have to keep pace with the Western powers and the modern world. It couldn't stay in this zone of thought that Russia could always be the same. It could always be this traditionalist country, its own little entity. It would eventually have to modernize. One thing to note is that while Nicholas himself died peacefully, and there were no consequences of himself for his lack of modernization, his family would eventually be overthrown in 1917 by revolutionaries because of these exact reasons, because Russia failed to modernize and because it failed to really put itself forward in the modern world. and that's the consequences of refusing to get with the times. That's what Nicholas did. He refused to modernize. He refused to change his ways, and eventually it didn't hurt him, but eventually it hurt his family down the road. His stubbornness. And then this is the big bibliography. If you have any questions, these are the sources I use. So yes, thank you for your time, everybody.